There are certain universes that just pull you in, not because they have space magic, alien gods, or galaxy-ending super weapons, but because they feel believable, dangerous, and grounded. That is exactly why Livid and I have always loved the Expanse universe. If you've never read the books or watched the shows, genuinely, do yourself a favor and fix that, because it is one of the best science fiction universes to experience. So when we heard a while back that there was a game coming out from Owlcat Games nonetheless, we knew we had to get involved. My name is Kodiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and now, after going hands-on with the game, we can finally talk about the Expanse Osiris Reborn, a third-person action RPG that might end up being the next incarnation of a modern-day Mass Effect. Now, to be clear, what we played was a vertical slice, one level, a handful of gameplay systems, and a small look at the game's overall take on combat, dialogue, exploration, and progression. This is not some final verdict on the game, that will come later. That being said, there are definitely some rough edges, and some things that we're already concerned about, but after playing through this level twice, once as a Belter officer and once as an Earther hacker, there's a lot that stood out in a positive way too. The basic setup feels immediately familiar if you have played a game like Mass Effect. You supposedly create your own character, choosing whether they are an Earther, a Belter, or a Martian, and then you progress through the game, building out a crew of specialists who will help you deal with the political conflicts, warring factions, and larger threats that exist throughout the Expanse universe. In this preview build, we had access to two archetypes, Officer and Hacker. At first, it wasn't really clear what separated the two playstyles beyond some flavor text, so we actually replayed the demo multiple times to better understand how much these choices mattered. The answer is, at least so far, quite a bit. The Officer felt more direct than aggressive. You had access to things like frag grenades and incendiary rounds, leaning more into straightforward combat. Meanwhile, the Hacker felt much more tactical. We had access to a tactical scanner that could reveal enemy position and increase damage dealt to them by 30%. Also, a pandemic algorithm that could stun enemies with electrical damage, as well as a gremlin drone swarm that would continuously pursue and damage targets. The contrast was apparent and immediately made combat feel different depending on which set of gear you were running. To be honest, combat is probably the thing that surprised us the most. This is a heavily cover-based third-person shooter. You are constantly sliding between barriers, leaning out to take shots, flanking enemies, and looking for opportunities to use your gadgets or environmental hazards. What really makes it work is the tactical pause system. You can drastically slow down time and then start issuing commands to your squad mates, targeting enemy positions and lining up gadget use. It's not a full freeze-frame tactical pause, but it slows things down enough that you can actually think through the battle, but still need to take action in a reasonable amount of time. That system, in harmony with the level design, really created some dynamic moments. You can shoot explosive containers to set enemies on fire. You can destroy cover. You can blow enemies out into zero-G environments. You can target environmental systems and use your squad skills to manipulate the battlefield. And to our surprise, there was just a lot in this one level, which bodes well for the full game. Now, one of the coolest examples of this came near the end of the level. We were able to call in direct fire support from Zafar, giving us indirect control over the ship's PDCs. For people unfamiliar with the Expanse, PDCs are basically ballistic defense systems mounted on ships, primarily designed to intercept incoming torpedoes, but from a damage standpoint, these things shred through armor plating like butter. In this mission, though, they could be used offensively. You could have those cannons tear through sections of the station itself, destroying enemies and turning entire parts of the environment into debris fields. It was one of those moments where the game suddenly stopped feeling like another generic sci-fi shooter and really started feeling like The Expanse. Hopefully, that's not just a one-off gimmick, because it was easily one of the standout moments from this small preview, but clearly, Owlcat Games knows the source material and how to tap into it. Gunplay also felt solid. Weapons have distinct recoil patterns, fire rates, responsiveness, and stat profiles. You can clearly compare damage, range, reload time, magazine size, accuracy, critical damage multipliers, and more very easily, which for a lot of us is important in an ARPG. Some weapons even have unique modifiers. For example, the early weapons that we started with used plastic bullets, making them 20% weaker than standard rounds. Obviously, our priority then was to replace those with a stronger weapon as soon as possible, but it's that kind of small detail which helps make loot feel more meaningful because it's not just swapping to the next gun for an incremental upgrade. Other systems like the game's movement are definitely areas of weakness at this point. Characters feel a bit floaty and not in the zero-G sense. There simply isn't enough weight behind their movement, especially when transitioning in and out of cover or sprinting around the environment. It doesn't feel outright bad, but compared to the snappiness of the gunplay, movement feels noticeably undercooked. That's easily the biggest gameplay issue we had throughout this preview. Outside of combat, the game seems to be leaning heavily into exploration, skill checks, and player choice, and honestly, this is part of the preview we ended up liking the most. Osiris Reborn is absolutely the kind of RPG where you want to search every room, click every terminal, and inspect every suspicious corner of the world. Right in the opening lobby, there were crafting materials hidden everywhere. Fabric, wire, spare parts, all of these resources are used to upgrade your gear, weapons, gadgets, and subsystems. That alone gives you a reason to explore, but beyond that, we also found things like the Pinwater 4 office terminal, which contained your more standard lore dump, but increasingly, it also had a hidden side quest tied to a completely different area later in the game. That's exactly the kind of thing we love, missable content hidden in believable locations. The skill check system also seems really promising. There are checks tied to engineering, athletics, perception, persuasion, and more. In one playthrough, we had enough engineering to unlock a terminal, trace a conduit line through the environment, and access a hidden room containing subsystem gear. In another playthrough, we didn't have enough engineering. At first, it looked like we were just locked out, but then we realized we could use the focus drugs we found to temporarily increase non-combat skills by 1 point, which let us pass the check anyways. That kind of flexibility is great. It doesn't always get you through, but it's a way to bridge the gap when you need it the most, and there were similar moments throughout the level. Athletics let us move objects to reach loot, perception revealed hidden compartments with powerful weapons and gear, engineering gave us access to an entirely different route during a spacewalk sequence to reach a secret loot room, and because we failed some of those checks in one playthrough and succeeded in another, we got to see just how much those choices can change what you find. In one playthrough of the level, we found a hidden handgun with better stats and perks than anything we had seen up until that point. In another playthrough, we completely missed it. Not only does this create replayability, but ultimately it means that your squad composition matters a lot. Every character appears to have their own skill proficiency and even passive traits. One companion, Jay, had a passive called Twin Bond, which increases the player character's lowest skill by 1 point. That might not sound exciting on paper, but in a game filled with skill checks, suddenly that one passive could become the difference between unlocking a hidden route or missing it entirely. The progression system also seems pretty deep, at least conceptually. Weapons, gadgets, and subsystem gear can all be upgraded. You can improve their stats, unlock perks, and build around different playstyles. The problem is that most of the perks we saw during the preview were not especially exciting. Most of them were fairly basic stat bonuses, more crit chance, more damage resistance. There were a few exceptions that modified gadgets or affected companions, but for the most part the perk system felt pretty safe. That doesn't mean it'll stay that way in the full game. We were only seeing a very small slice of what is probably a much larger progression system. Still, based on what we saw, gadgets seem like they're going to be the real build-defining feature because they directly dictate your active combat skills. There are also separate character-based skill trees focused on things like Shooter, Gadgets, Survivalist, and Leader. Shooter improves combat efficiency and weapon performance, Gadgets make abilities stronger, Survivalist helps keep you alive, and Leader appears to focus more on squad commands and companion effectiveness. Again, very Mass Effect, and honestly, that is not a complaint. If anything, the Expanse Osiris Reborn seems to know exactly what kind of game it wants to be. Where things get a little more mixed is the presentation. Visually, the environments do a really good job capturing the sometimes clean, sometimes repair-in-progress look of stations in the Expanse universe. There's a bit of grit to everything: exposed pipes, dim lighting, tight corridors, and that spacewalk section in particular looked great. You really get that sense of scale and danger that makes the Expanse feel so distinct from more fantastical science fiction settings. But the voice acting is much more uneven. Some characters sounded fantastic. Zafar's line felt weighty and organic. Luciana felt like a classic traveling vendor brimming with gossip of her customers. And Oscar, for a very brief moment, had a solid performance. But the main character and one of the supporting squad mates felt much flatter. Not necessarily bad, but robotic. The emotional delivery was missing, and in a universe like The Expanse, where politics, tension, betrayal, and personal drama are such a huge part of the appeal, that matters. This is not a setting where people are just dumping exposition on you for 20 hours. The dialogue needs to have weight. It needs to feel believable. Hopefully, this is one of those areas that improves either before launch or further into the game, because if the performances are inconsistent across the board, it could drag down what otherwise feels like a very promising RPG. One last thing we really appreciated was the game's willingness to create divergent paths. At one point during a spacewalk section, we were told to wait for Zafar to distract an enemy ship blocking the path. Suddenly, Jay pointed out an open airlock nearby. We took that route during our first playthrough and ended up in a completely different section of the station with its own loot, skill checks, and environmental hazards. But during our second playthrough, we took the other route. It had different encounters, different rewards, and a completely different feel. Eventually, the paths reconnect, but that moment really stood out when we knew it existed. If the full game is built around those kinds of decisions where your build, your companion, and your choices can all shape the path you take through a mission, then replayability could end up being one of this game's biggest strengths. Overall, and based on this single vertical slice, the Expanse Osiris Reborn feels genuinely promising. Movement still needs some work, voice acting is inconsistent at times, and some of the progression systems need to show more of their depth before we can really judge them, but combat is satisfying, exploration is rewarding, and more importantly, the game actually feels like it belongs in the Expanse universe. That is the most important thing. It captures the grounded technology, the tension in every dialogue exchange, the real danger of zero-G, and the feeling that every small decision can spiral into something much bigger. If Owlcat can stick the landing, build out the progression systems, and smooth out some of the rough edges, this could absolutely become a sci-fi ARPG that a lot of people will enjoy. For anyone that's out there that's been desperate for something to scratch that Mass Effect itch, this could end up being the closest thing we have seen in years. So that's our takeaways after a couple hours in this preview. As always, if you guys appreciate the work that goes into making these videos, drop a like and consider subscribing. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching and play on.